In the spring of 1931, in the flatlands south of Yazoo City, Mississippi, the ground had not yet hardened back from winter, and Delroy Moss stood at the edge of his 18 acres watching the county road for a truck that would not slow down for him. The Great Depression had already taken the cotton price from 22 cents a pound down to less than 5. It had taken his neighbor Rupert Calloway's tractor. It had taken the church roof fund and 3 of the Tatum family's children to Chicago looking for work that did not exist there either. What it had not yet taken, what people assumed was too modest to bother with, was the single draft ox Delroy kept in a shed behind his house, a thick-shouldered animal he called August after the month his father had been born. August was the axis around which everything turned. The spring tilling, the furrow rows, the capacity to plant 18 acres in the window between last frost and summer heat. Without August, there was no crop. Without a crop, there was no Moss farm. This was understood by everyone in the colored quarters south of the city, and it was understood by Sterling Hathawi at the First Consolidated Bank of Yazoo County, and it was understood most quietly of all by Delroy himself. The belief that ran through the county like groundwater in 1931 was this: a man without a draft animal was not a farmer. He was a man with dirt. The colored extension agents had been telling sharecroppers for a generation to invest in animal power, to mechanize when possible, to follow the cotton schedule set by the land-grant college bulletins. Every conversation at the Piney Grove Baptist Fellowship Hall came back to the same arithmetic: acres times yield times price, and the denominator of all of it was the animal pulling the plow. Delroy had heard this formula repeated so many times it had started to sound like gospel. He believed it the way he believed in gravity, not because he had tested it, but because everyone around him treated it as untestable. His grandfather's hoe hung on 2 nails inside the shed door, directly across from August's stall. It was a heavy-headed thing with a handle worn smooth at the grip and dark with old oil, where hands had held it for 40 years. His grandfather, a man named Joseph, who had worked these same clay flats as a freedman after 1865, had used that hoe to break ground before he could afford an animal, turning the soil in long, patient passes, deeper than was common. The way his own mother had shown him, she worked the earth in the Senegambia before she was taken. Delroy had never thought of the hoe as a tool. He had thought of it as history. The distinction was about to collapse. On the 14th of March, a Tuesday, the truck did come down the county road, and it did slow. 2 men from the bank got out, showed Delroy a paper he had already seen in a letter the week before, and led August out of the shed, while Delroy stood in the yard with his hands at his sides. Rupert Calloway, who lived across the field road, came out onto his porch and watched and said nothing. Delroy's neighbor Odessa Tatum, hanging wash on her line, turned her face away. The truck pulled out with August standing in the bed, his tail switching once as the vehicle gained speed, and then the road was empty, and the shed was empty, and the 18 acres behind the house were unbroken ground. Delroy walked back into the shed. He stood in front of the hoe for a long time. Then he took it down from the nails. Sterling Hathawi was not a man who had come from old Mississippi money, and this was precisely why he behaved as though he had. He had arrived in Yazoo County from Natchez in 1921 with a letter of credit, a particular talent for reading land values, and a social manner that the established families found slightly too eager. By 1931, he had made himself indispensable to those same families by extending them credit during the early lean years and then quietly tightening the terms once their alternatives had narrowed. He wore linen suits even in March. He kept a secretary who was a white woman, which was a statement in itself. His office at First Consolidated had a window onto the main lobby, so that anyone doing business with a teller could look up and see him at his desk, which Hathawi knew and had arranged deliberately. On the 21st of March, 7 days after the ox was taken, Delroy walked into First Consolidated to ask about the terms of the outstanding lien on his property. A lien, he had been told in a letter, was separate from the animal repossession. Rupert Calloway had come with him, not because Delroy asked, but because Rupert understood that a colored man entering that bank alone was a different proposition than two colored men entering together. Odessa Tatum was in the lobby at the teller window, paying a small note on her household account, and she turned when the door opened. Hathawi came out of his office before Delroy had reached the center of the room. "Moss," he said, not loudly but clearly, with the particular projection of a man who does not need to raise his voice to ensure he is heard across a room. "I was expecting your wife, frankly. Thought she might have more sense about the situation." He paused to let the teller, a thin young man named Gerald, absorb this. "You understand the lien position means the land is already pledged against the outstanding balance. What exactly are you hoping to discuss?" Delroy stood in the center of the lobby on the dark wood floor and looked at Hathawi directly. He said that he had come to understand the lien schedule clearly, and that he intended to make the spring planting regardless of the equipment situation, and that he wanted the bank's written confirmation of the payment timeline. His voice was level. There was no performance of anger in it, no performance of deference either. Just the flat statement of a man who had decided on his position before he walked through the door. Hathawi smiled in the way that is not a smile. "A farmer without a draft animal is not a farmer, Moss. He's a man who owes a bank money on 18 acres of clay." Gerald looked down at his counter. Odessa, still at the far teller window, had gone very still. Rupert, standing one step behind Delroy's shoulder, pressed his lips together. Hathawi turned and walked back into his office and pulled the door to, not quite shut. Delroy held for 3 seconds, then went to the window and asked Gerald for the written lien schedule. Gerald printed it and slid it under the grate without making eye contact. On the way out, Odessa caught Delroy's eye for just a moment, and what was in her face was not pity exactly. It was the specific grief of a witness who cannot intervene. Rupert waited until they were on the sidewalk before he exhaled. "Man talks to you like that in front of everybody," he said. Delroy folded the lien schedule and put it in his shirt pocket. "Yes," he said, "he does." He said nothing else. He was already thinking about the hoe. Delroy began on the north quarter of his land, the section closest to the tree line where the shade in the afternoon gave a man working alone an extra half hour before the heat became serious. He worked with the heavy-headed hoe and a long-handled spade, and he worked in a pattern that he had not fully articulated even to himself yet. It was closer to memory than plan. His grandfather had told him, when Delroy was 7 years old, that the old people in the family came from a place where the women knew to dig down before they planted, to turn the sleeping layer, to bring up what had been resting below. Joseph had said this while sharpening the hoe on a wet stone, not as instruction but as conversation, the way old men talk about the past to children who they assume are not listening. Delroy had been listening. The technique he developed in the first 2 weeks of March into April was this. He dug the furrow to a standard 6-inch depth first, removing that surface layer and setting it aside. Then he worked the spade down another 12 inches into the layer below, breaking it, aerating it, turning it up against the surface layer he had displaced. The total inversion brought subsoil material up to within 2 inches of the final grade, mixing the reddish lower earth, which he noticed was different in color and texture from the gray-brown surface clay, with the darker topsoil before he pressed the seed in. The rows were slower than any ox-drawn plow could manage. He made 3 rows the first full day. He made 4 the second. By the end of the first week, he had established a rhythm that his body accepted, and the soreness moved from acute to dull and then disappeared as his hands and back recalibrated to the work. Rupert came on a Saturday morning and watched Delroy in the field for a long time before speaking. "You know what the extension man would say about this?" Rupert said. Delroy kept the hoe moving. "Extension man lost his demonstration plot to the bank last fall," Delroy said. "I know that," Rupert said. "I'm just saying." What neither of them said aloud was the obvious, that at this pace, Delroy could not plant 18 acres before the corn window closed. He might manage 10, he might manage 8. He kept digging. The letter from First Consolidated arrived on April the 3rd, addressed formally to Delroy Moss of Route 4 Yazoo County, and it informed him that the bank was conducting a routine reassessment of all agricultural liens in the county portfolio, and that an appraiser would be sent to evaluate the Moss property in the coming weeks. The letter was signed by Sterling Hathawi in a large, confident hand. Delroy read it at the kitchen table, then folded it along its original creases and placed it with the lien schedule in the cigar box he kept on the shelf above the stove. His wife, Clara, asked what it meant. "It means he's counting what he thinks he's going to take before he takes it," Delroy said. Clara said nothing, which was the kind of nothing that means everything understood. The next morning Delroy was in the field before sunrise, the hoe working the dark soil before the birds had started, and the red earth was coming up from below with each turn, heavy and strange and unlike anything he had seen at the surface level of his land. By the last week of April, something was happening in the first rows Delroy had planted that he had not expected, or rather had hoped for, without letting himself believe in it. The corn shoots in those early rows were standing a full inch taller than the shoots from the handful of seeds he had put in a control plot, using the standard shallow method. He had done this deliberately, set aside a short strip of ground to plant the conventional way, so he had a comparison. The conventional shoots were healthy. The inverted rows were pushing faster. The color was deeper, a more saturated green, the kind of color you saw in bottomland corn after a wet year. Delroy's land was not bottomland. It was the same upland clay that everyone else in the area was farming, the same gray surface that took fertilizer moderately and drained unevenly and produced a reliable but unremarkable yield in good years and failed in bad ones. He took a handful of the red subsoil that he had been turning up and looked at it carefully in the morning light. It was heavier than topsoil, almost greasy between the fingers, and it left an iron-colored stain on his palm. He had no laboratory. He had no instrument. What he had was 40 years of watching his grandfather and his father work this land and the land around it, and what he knew intuitively, confirmed now by the behavior of the corn, was that this red layer had been sitting below the gray surface for a very long time, undisturbed, accumulating something that the gray topsoil had depleted through decades of conventional planting. He did not have words like laterite or micronutrient profile. He had the red stain on his palm and the taller shoots and the hoe was enough. The appraiser came on a Thursday in late April, a thin man from Greenwood who introduced himself without a first name and walked the property with a clipboard, making notes in a small handwriting that Delroy could not read from the required distance. He did not go into the fields. He looked at the house, walked the shed, measured the frontage, and asked Delroy a series of questions about the lien balance in a voice that suggested he had already written his conclusions before arriving. When the appraiser's truck pulled away, Rupert materialized at the fence line. "What do you think he wrote down?" Rupert said. "Whatever Hathawi told him to write down," Delroy said. He walked back into the field, lifted the hoe from where he had set it against a fence post, and continued the row he had left unfinished when the truck arrived. The hoe was in his hands every morning now before the light was full. It had become an extension of something, not just his arm, but his intention. The handle, worn to a dark smoothness at the grip from his grandfather's decades of use, fit into his palms in a way that newer tools did not. The weight distributed forward into the blade so that the swing was efficient rather than effortful. He had stopped thinking of it as borrowed. He thought of it as given. The summer of 1931 came in dry. Not catastrophically dry, not the kind of dry that broke things immediately, but the kind of steady insufficiency that accumulated across July into August and showed up first in the lighter soils. The sandier patches, the fields that had been worked shallow for too many seasons. Rupert Calloway's corn started showing heat stress in the second week of July, the leaves curling at the edges, the color shifting toward a yellowish cast that a farmer learns to read the way a doctor reads a face. 3 farms south of Delroy, along the road toward Benton, 2 operations that were already under bank pressure went into visible distress. The stalks thinner than they should have been by midsummer, the ears not setting properly. Delroy's rows held. The corn in the inverted plots was not immune to drought. No corn is, but it was accessing something that the shallower-rooted conventional crop was not. The inversion had broken the hardpan layer that typically sat at 8 to 10 inches in this soil type, the compressed subsoil that roots hit like a floor and turn sideways along, never penetrating further down where the moisture lingered longer after a rain. By breaking that layer and mixing in the red subsoil material, Delroy had created a root channel that the plants were using, pushing down past where the summer dry reached. Finding the residual moisture that the deeper clay retained, he did not know this mechanically. He saw it in the color of his corn against everyone else's corn, and that was knowledge enough. At the Yazoo City post office on a Saturday in late July, Sterling Hathawi came in while Delroy was collecting his mail. Hathawi made a point of pausing. He looked at Delroy with an expression that had practiced itself into something resembling concern. "Heard you've been working those acres by hand," Hathawi said, loud enough for the two men waiting at the postal counter, both white, both known to Hathawi, to hear without turning around. "Admirable determination. Won't change the arithmetic on the lien, but admirable." He picked up his own mail from the postmaster's hand and left without waiting for a response, his shoes making a clean sound on the post office floor, the door swinging shut behind him. The postmaster, a quiet older man named Ira Blaine, looked at Delroy and then looked at his counter. Delroy took his mail, folded it under his arm, and walked out into the July heat, back to his truck, back to his land. He was tired in the way that accumulates rather than peaks, a tiredness that lived in the shoulders and the low back and the hands, that sleep addressed but did not resolve. Clara put liniment on his palms every evening and did not talk about it, which was the best kind of care. The corn was knee-high now, in the inverted rows, and on evenings when the light came in low from the west, it had a quality that Delroy could not name and did not need to. He set the hoe against the porch rail each night and looked at the field before going in. The harvest came in October, and it was not what anyone had predicted for the 1931 season in Yazoo County. The county average for corn yield that year, reported later by the Agricultural Office, was 31 bushels per acre, down from 42 the previous year due to the summer dry and the general deterioration of soil condition under Depression-era management, farmers cutting back on purchased inputs, planting tired seed, skipping the lime applications that the extension agents recommended. Delroy's inverted soil rows across the 9 acres he had managed to fully treat before the planting window closed yielded 56 bushels to the acre. The standard rows he had planted as a control yielded 30. The difference was 26 bushels per acre across 9 acres, and those numbers, computed in Delroy's handwriting on the back of a seed envelope, were the first piece of evidence he had that what he had done was not an accident. Word moved the way word moves in a rural county, not through newspapers or official channels, but through the specific geometry of who talks to whom at church and at the feed store and at the roadside exchange where people sold eggs and garden surplus on Saturday mornings. Rupert Calloway told his cousin. His cousin's wife mentioned it to Odessa Tatum. Odessa told 3 people at Piney Grove Baptist. By the 3rd Sunday in October, men were asking Delroy after service about the red soil, about the depth he had worked to, about whether it was specific to his land or whether it might be present elsewhere at the same depth in the same clay-flat geography. Delroy answered every question carefully and completely. He did not understand why what he had found would be limited to his land, and he said so. Sterling Hathawi heard about the yield through Gerald at the bank teller window, who had heard it from his brother-in-law who attended a different church but moved in the same commercial orbit as the Calloway family. Hathawi sat with this information for 3 days before acting on it, and in those 3 days he made the particular error that arrogant men make when they encounter unexpected information. He reframed it as a threat rather than a curiosity, and began planning the response before he fully understood the thing he was responding to. He called the county assessor's office on a Thursday and spoke with a man named Duval about the possibility of a supplemental property tax assessment on agricultural holdings that had demonstrated unusual productivity, a provision that existed in Mississippi statute for commercial operations but had never been applied to subsistence farming. Duval noted this in his office log. Hathawi did not know that Duval noted things. The document arrived on the 2nd of January, 1932, by registered mail, which required Delroy to drive into town and sign for it at the post office, which Hathawi had arranged deliberately so that Delroy would have to collect the news in a public place. The envelope contained a supplemental tax assessment notice from the Yazoo County Assessor's Office, citing Mississippi Statute 4471, Agricultural Productivity Adjustment Clause, and assessing an additional $340 in county tax on the Moss property, payable within 30 days, with foreclosure proceedings to commence on day 31 in the event of non-payment. $340 in January of 1932 was not a number a small farmer arrived at. It was a number that had been chosen because it was not arrive-atable. The notice was signed by Duval, but the language in the third paragraph, which described the Moss property's commercial-scale productivity inconsistent with subsistence classification, had been written by someone who worked for Sterling Hathawi. Delroy recognized the phrasing from Hathawi's letters. Calvin Breo, who farmed 40 acres on the other side of Piney Grove Church, and had known Delroy since childhood, came over that evening when the word reached him through Rupert. He sat at the kitchen table with Delroy and Clara, and read the assessment notice twice, slowly, moving his lips slightly on the statute numbers. Then he put it down. "I don't see a way through this one," Calvin said. He was not a man who spoke lightly or for effect. 30 days, $340, in January, in Mississippi. In 1932, he listed these facts the way you list things that add up to an impossibility. Clara was at the stove and did not turn around. "I know what you're going to say," Calvin said to Delroy, "but I'm telling you what I see, and what I see is the end of this farm." Rupert, who had come with Calvin and was standing near the door, said nothing because there was nothing to add. The community response was grief, which is different from despair but adjacent to it. At Piney Grove the following Sunday, 3 separate people took Delroy's hand and held it longer than necessary, the specific pressure of a handshake that is also a goodbye. The women of the church, without coordination, prepared food and left it on Delroy's porch on Monday morning. This was what the community knew how to offer, and Delroy received it without speaking about what it meant that they were offering it. He went into the shed that afternoon, not for any specific reason, and stood in the empty stall where August had been, and looked at the hoe on the nails across from it. He took it down and turned it in his hands, feeling the worn grip, the forward weight of the blade. He had planted 9 acres with this. He had found what was below the surface. He put it back on the nails and went to the cigar box above the stove, and took out every letter, every document, every lien schedule and notice, and spread them on the kitchen table and began to read them in order, from the first to the last. The contradiction was not hidden. That was the first thing Delroy understood when he spread the documents on the table and read them as a set rather than as individual arrivals. The repossession receipt for August, issued by First Consolidated on March 14th of 1931, listed the animal's assessed value as $162, applied against an outstanding balance on Delroy's equipment lien of $88. The receipt showed a credit of $88 to the lien and listed the remaining $74 as proceeds retained by lender, per standard recovery clause. No such clause appeared in the original lien document, which Delroy had kept in the cigar box since he signed it in 1929. The bank had applied the ox's full value against the lien, then retained the surplus without disclosure or return. This was not a clerical error. It was a separate, documentable act, and Delroy had the receipt and the original lien side by side on his kitchen table at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night in January of 1932. The supplemental tax assessment was the second problem. Statute 4471, which Hathawi had cited through Duval, contained a provision that explicitly excluded properties under 50 cultivated acres from the Commercial Productivity Adjustment Clause. Delroy's 18 acres were 18 acres. The exclusion was unambiguous. Duval had applied the clause incorrectly, or had applied it at Hathawi's direction knowing it was incorrect, and the evidence of that direction was Duval's office log, which recorded a telephone call from Sterling Hathawi on a specific date requesting exploration of supplemental assessment options for the Moss property. Delroy did not know about the log yet. What he knew was that the statute number on the notice and the actual text of the statute, which he found after 3 days of work through a contact at the Yazoo County Courthouse who owed Rupert Calloway a favor, did not match the application Duval had made. Delroy wrote a letter to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund office in Jackson, Mississippi, enclosing copies of every document and a handwritten chronology of events. He mailed it on the 14th of January. On the 22nd, a woman named Marion Polk from the LDF office drove to Delroy's farm in a car and sat at his kitchen table for 4 hours reading. She was methodical and spoke infrequently, and when she spoke it was to ask for a specific document or to confirm a date. At the end of the 4 hours she said 2 things. First, that she would be filing a formal complaint with the Mississippi Banking Commission regarding the ox repossession surplus retention, and second, that she was going to contact Duval directly, because in her experience men who recorded their conversations with the people directing them toward illegal acts did so for a reason. She drove back to Jackson the same evening. 4 days later, Duval called Marion Polk's office and confirmed that he had received a verbal directive from Sterling Hathawi and that his office log documented it. Duval was facing his own exposure under the fraudulent assessment and chose, as Hathawi had always underestimated such men might, to choose his own protection over Hathawi's. The hearing at the Yazoo County Courthouse took place on the 9th of March, 1932, exactly 1 year and 1 week after the morning the truck came and took August away. Marion Polk presented the Banking Commission complaint first, entering into the record the repossession receipt, the original lien document, and the discrepancy between them, $74 in undisclosed surplus retention, which under Mississippi banking statute constituted a recoverable misappropriation. She then entered Duval's written statement, which described in plain declarative sentences the telephone call from Sterling Hathawi, the specific request for a tax instrument that would trigger foreclosure proceedings against the Moss property, and Hathawi's explicit awareness that the property did not meet the 50-acre threshold for commercial productivity assessment. Hathawi sat at the opposite table in a good suit and did not look at Delroy. His attorney objected to the Duval statement on procedural grounds. The objection was noted and overruled. Rupert Calloway was in the gallery. Odessa Tatum was in the gallery. Calvin Breaux was there. The same postmaster, Ira Blaine, who had watched the exchange at the post office, had come without being asked. Gerald the bank teller sat in the back row, his hands folded, his face expressing nothing readable. Hathawi had made his most contemptuous statement about Delroy in this same county's public life, at the bank lobby at the post office, and the people who had witnessed those moments were present now in the gallery of the courthouse to witness the accounting. The Banking Commission finding, issued the same day, was unambiguous. First Consolidated Bank of Yazoo County had misapplied the ox repossession proceeds, had directed a county assessor to apply a statutory provision to a non-qualifying property, and had done so with documented intent to trigger foreclosure. The Moss lien was declared void, the supplemental tax assessment was rescinded. The bank was ordered to return the $74 in retained surplus with interest. The Mississippi Banking Commission referred Sterling Hathawi to the State Attorney General's office for further review. and First Consolidated's operating license was placed under provisional status pending the outcome of that review. The license was not renewed. Sterling Hathawi resigned from First Consolidated 2 weeks later and was not mentioned in the Yazoo County agricultural record again. Delroy walked out of the courthouse into the March light and stood on the steps for a moment. Rupert came and stood beside him. Calvin shook his hand twice, hard, and didn't say anything. Odessa Tatum said, "Well, that was sufficient. Delroy had not won by fighting. He had kept his documents in a cigar box and let them tell the truth that Hathawi's own records had already told. The institution that had been used against him had contained, in its own ledgers, everything necessary to undo the man who had turned it into a weapon." The spring planting of 1932 began on a Saturday, and for the first time in 2 years Delroy had help. Rupert came with his own tools. Calvin brought 2 of his sons. Odessa's husband, a quiet man named Jerome who had not previously involved himself in farming questions, showed up at the fence line with a long-handled spade and said simply that he had heard about the depth of the work and wanted to understand it. Delroy walked each of them through the method. The standard furrow first, the surface layer set aside, then the spade down 12 to 14 inches into the subsoil, the red layer broken and turned, the mixing of horizons before seeding. He showed them the color difference between the surface soil and what came up from below, the iron-heavy red clay that left its mark on everything it touched. He told them about his grandfather Joseph, about the women in the family's memory who had worked the earth this way before anyone in this country had told them it was wrong. By midsummer of 1932, 4 farms around Delroy's were experimenting with the inversion method on partial plots, comparing yields the way Delroy had done with his own control strip. The results were not identical across all properties. Soil composition varied, but in the clay-flat geography south of Yazoo City, where the laterite subsoil appeared consistently at 14 to 20 inches, the inverted plots showed improved moisture retention and reduced fertilizer requirements across the board. What Delroy had found was not a trick. It was a system, and the system had been waiting below the surface of this land for anyone willing to go deep enough to find it. Sterling Hathawi's house on Depot Street went up for sale in the summer of 1932. The furniture was auctioned in June. The Natchez family he had come from did not send a representative for the auction. He appeared in no county record after September of that year, and no one who had known him socially went out of their way to find out where he went. The community did not celebrate this. They noted it the way you note the end of a long pressure, with a quiet exhale and a return to the work that had always been there. The hoe went back on its 2 nails in the shed in the fall. Once the harvest was in and the ground had been turned under for winter, Delroy did not hang it there because it was finished. He hung it there because it belonged in the shed, the way the farm belonged in the landscape, as a thing that persisted, that had outlasted what had been sent against it. His grandfather, Joseph, had carried the knowledge of deep turning across decades and distances, from a woman who had learned it on ground that was not this ground, and the knowledge had been waiting in the shape of a worn handle, and 40 years of silence until the morning a truck took August away, and there was nothing left to do but reach for the tool and go down. What Delroy understood by the end, and what he told Calvin one evening on the porch as the light went flat, was not a philosophy about persistence or survival, though it was those things. It was something simpler, that what you need is often already there, and it is below what you think you know, and the work of getting to it is exactly the work it looks like. Slow, unglamorous, done with what you have in your hands. The land had not changed. He had changed the depth he was willing to go.